This video features footage from Skyrim and discussion of some of its environments and animals, but all of the music has been removed from the Skyrim footage. I can understand if you still don't want to watch the video. It's also a bit of a downer due to the topics covered. I love the ocean. The overwhelming size, the depths, the huge creatures that could be lurking just under the surface. I love it nearly as much as I am terrified by it. I have an intense fear of open water as well. Just getting the footage for this video gave me some anxiety. As a kid, I rented National Geographic tapes, mostly about sharks, as often as I could.
The sharks.
I knew I didn't want to see one in real life, again another intense fear, but I was still fascinated by them, huddled up on the couch in a big t-shirt stretched over my legs and jumping every time a shark opened its mouth to bite. They seemed totally unreal, fantasy monsters or ancient dinosaurs, completely outside of and apart from my world, but they were real, and I loved them. I guess I'm like Batman, but with sharks, and I'm not rich or fit or a cop. Renting these movies gave me the opportunity to see something in nature that I would probably never see otherwise. Video games also offer the perfect opportunity to explore the seas in a similar way. Often, however, oceans in games are quite disappointing. In an excellent article for Vice's Postscript series, Cameron Kunzelman writes that he too is disappointed in many nautical video games, noting that the oceanic focus in games is always one of two things, wonder or surprise, and never on the environmental destruction currently facing our real oceans. Games that revolve around the ocean frequently rely on awe and spectacle, as seen in the early stages of Abzu, or else they use the depths to invoke fear and suspense, as employed in the later sections of Abzu and the game Soma. These games, according to Kunzelman, fail to account for the real dangers our oceans are in and are therefore a disservice to us and to the creatures most at risk. While ocean-centered games may rely on these two modes, I think that in contrast, many open-world games, Skyrim and The Witcher 3 specifically in this case, unintentionally show us the outcome that pollution, overfishing, and climate change will have on our ecosystems. While they may purportedly be medieval fantasy, these games feature biomes that are largely devoid of natural animal and plant life, and showcase very little biodiversity overall, which portends the future of our oceans and our planet rather than our past. For the purposes of this essay, I won't be including intelligent creatures or those who seem to have a society, that is, giants, trolls, and sirens, for example, magical entities like spriggans, because they don't function in an environment the way regular animals do, or fantasy animals that don't have any sort of analog in the real world. Mammoths? They're just bigger, pointier cows, they count. Drowners? What the hell are those? What do they do in an ecosystem? I don't think that counts. I will also not be taking into consideration the various costs or working conditions involved with the making and distributing of these games, even though they do deserve scrutiny. The effects of crunch on employees, the valuable resources used for packaging and discs and servers and consoles, the money spent, and the other waste made in the process are all legitimate issues and certainly contribute to some of the problems mentioned here. As Gretchen Felker-Martin once tweeted about this web of problems, we need to accept as a culture that morally, logistically, and ecologically, art needs to be smaller. This is a topic too large for the scope of this video, however, and extends beyond video games, so I'll leave that essay to someone more qualified. Several environmental factors are combining to cause serious damage to our oceans and seas. Agricultural runoff is seeping into the ocean, creating areas that can't sustain life. Coral bleaching and increased water acidity damage corals and other calcifying species. Rising sea temperatures are changing what can make a home in our waters. Overfishing and the general depletion of apex predators through poaching or habitat destruction are also disrupting sea life. As noted by Adrian C. Steyer et al. In an article for Science Advances magazine, a lack of apex predators in an environment is one deleterious effect that humans have on an ecosystem, and is also an indicator of the decline of that ecosystem because of the fundamental role that apex predators can play in ecosystem functioning, disease regulation, and biodiversity maintenance. Apex predators are consumers that kill their prey during or shortly following an attack, consume many prey over a lifetime, and are not often eaten after reaching adult size. Apex predators are more vulnerable to climate change and other effects of human activity than smaller animals due to their slower somatic growth rates, larger size at maturity, and longer generation lengths relative to prey, as well as their tendency to be poached and hunted by humans due to the bioaccumulation of toxins and pollutants from eating affected prey as well. This means that a disappearance of apex hunters in an area is likely a sign that the whole observed system is facing some sort of decline or crisis, or will be in the near future. Many of our apex predators, such as tigers and eagles, are currently in a state of endangerment and staring down extinction for many of these very reasons. They are hunted and driven out of their natural habitat, which is not a good sign for the future of those areas. In Skyrim, there are few terrestrial apex predators outside of the occasional sabercat, bear, and wolf. Skeever and horkers do appear to be varieties of predators, though they don't seem to function as apex predators. There are no aquatic apex predators in the game at all. This affects the rest of the system as well, depleting species beyond the apex predators. A review of the ecosystem off the Canadian East Coast in Trends in Ecology and Evolution by Martin Scheffer et al. Shows that the elimination of large predatory fish can also cause marked cascading effects on the pelagic food web. The list of prey animals on land in Skyrim is also relatively dire, a corollary to the elimination of apex predators. Terrestrial prey include only bats, deer, birds, elk, goats, rabbits, and foxes, though terrestrial may not be quite right for a few of those.
I told you once, I told you twice. I'm gonna treat your baby nice. I told you once, I told you twice. I'm gonna treat your baby nice.
The abundance of domesticated animals in Skyrim relative to wild animals is also reflective of our wildlife to come. These animals, namely dogs, chickens, oxen, mammoths, and horses, are commonly seen in most areas of the game. In the real world, these species will fare better during our climate crisis as they no longer rely solely on natural environments, in contrast to, say, bears or lions, and their needs are more likely to be considered by humans since we directly depend on them. It's much easier to convince people to care for their dog or dairy cows than it is to get them to care about, say, marmots or great white sharks.
The sharks.
Most of these animals have also more or less adapted to or are adaptable to more urban life. Horses can live in stables, humpback whales can't. As in our world, the domesticated animals in Skyrim are also transparently and directly beneficial to the player, providing goods like cheese, eggs, meat, and companionship in the case of dogs and horses. Along those same lines, most of the plants and insects that exist in Skyrim are advantageous to the player as ingredients for alchemy. Butterflies and dragonflies are relatively common because they are collectible. Bees, less common in-game but vital for pollinating ecosystems and essential for our planet's survival, also appear sporadically, but mainly as an ingredient for the player to collect. Animals that are not useful to humans are largely hostile. Wolves attack with little provocation. Non-hostile creatures whose usefulness to us is more opaque, such as whales, owls, beavers, etc., are simply not included. These two mechanics, or two modes of being, that is, collectability and hostility, are illustrative of the ways we interact with nature and point to the kinds of species we stand to lose in our future given our current priorities. If the animal doesn't hurt us or help us, it's an afterthought at best and non-existent at worst. Skyrim's aquatic creatures don't fare any better than their terrestrial counterparts either. The waterways in Skyrim house salmon, histcarp, silverside perch, and 3 other species of small fish scattered throughout the rivers and lakes. A bit of kelp or seagrass lines the riverbeds and sea floors. And then there's the slaughterfish, an aggressive, pervasive species that is characteristic of real-world invasive species. These invaders can wreak havoc on local environments by populating quickly and eating more of the natural resources in the area, leaving other species with less. Clams and barnacles can be found in the game as well, though they once again seem to exist solely to be plucked by the player and are not all that common. They also don't seem to have any function within their environment. This lack of big chonky boys at the top of the food chain trickles down through Skyrim's ecosystems, the only real kind of trickle down, and leaves the biomes feeling empty and lacking in variety. Our future forests, what may be left of them, and oceans will likely resemble their current digital counterparts in Skyrim in this regard. Mostly devoid of wildlife aside from a few adaptive species and domesticated animals. Similarly, The Witcher 3 features a huge number of fantastic beasts to hunt and kill, but little in the way of natural predators. The domestic fauna is as plentiful as it is in Skyrim, and there are a few prey animals, hare, deer, small birds, but discounting fantasy creatures, there are only 2 apex predators in the game, bears and wolves. If you include imaginary animals, several could be considered apex predators. Cockatrice, griffins, wyvern, and others are all large predatory beasts, but it's hard to know how they actually fit into a food web or what they do for specific ecosystems since there is no real-world counterpart for them. The Witcher's aquatic life is even more dreadful. A few species of small fish and sparse bright flora can be found in some of its shallower waterways, but when you sail or swim out to the open ocean, the picture is totally bleak. There are no predators to be found at all. The vanishing of apex predators is not the only environmental factor devastating the oceans. According to the National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration's PMEL carbon program, oceanic acidification can have an effect on the wildlife too. Photosynthetic algae and seagrasses may benefit from higher CO2 conditions in the ocean as they require CO2 to live like plants on land, and this process can be seen in the algal blooms in America's Great Lakes and in the oceans in The Witcher and Skyrim. The only life in these areas of the games is seagrass and algae, and the seagrass is abundant. On the other hand, the NOAA continues, studies have shown that lower environmental calcium carbonate saturate states can have a dramatic effect on some calcifying species, including oysters, clams, sea urchins, shallow water corals, deep sea corals, and calcareous plankton. Skyrim's mud crabs spend most of their time on or around land, and few other shellfish seem to exist, pointing to a possible acidification of Skyrim's waters. Corals are absent as well in both Skyrim and The Witcher. Both of these factors at play in the game's oceans, the plentiful seagrass and a dearth of calcifying creatures, reveal a possible picture of our future acidified oceans. While some fish can be found in Skyrim's rivers and lakes, when you travel north to the actual ocean, the water is completely empty, save for the seagrass. This may be an example of a dead zone. Dead zones are areas where, according to NASA, the water is so low in dissolved oxygen that sea creatures can't survive. This usually happens in areas that have been polluted by human activity, say by agricultural runoff. In this case, it appears that the entire accessible ocean has been rendered inhospitable. Similarly, almost nothing can be seen in The Witcher 3's oceans. After you swim past the very edges of the shores, there are no fish, no plants, no invertebrates, and no mammals. The oceans are cloudy and completely lifeless for miles. Lifeless, that is, outside of a handful of particular spots. In a specific area in The Witcher 3, a singular whale can spawn in the icy waters near a shipwreck. You can spot its tail cresting over the waves or dive under the surface and see its huge body stationary. As you approach it, however, it vanishes into the misty edge, reappearing elsewhere away from you or disappearing into the deep entirely, an almost too on-the-nose metaphor for our vanishing ocean life. Our oceans, modeled here by those in Skyrim and The Witcher, may be much more barren than they are today and will likely face mass extinctions in the coming decades if no changes are made. The lack of variety in these environments could be attributable to a lack of technology. Skyrim is 8 years old after all, and The Witcher isn't exactly a new release. But then, how come Jaws Unleashed came out 5 years before Skyrim, has way more sea life, and kind of rules? Much of this emptiness, I think, stems from the idea that the ocean in games serves merely as a boundary for players. As the player swims or sails to the edge of the explorable area in either game, they're met with a message telling them they can't go any farther.
Could use a portal about now.
This is a quick and easy way to mark the edges of a game, so it's understandable to make the ocean an endpoint for exploration. Much like the collectible/hostile duality in Skyrim's animals, the ocean here is treated strictly as a gameplay consideration. It isn't a rich and unique ecosystem, vulnerable and fascinating and worthy of attention and protection, but a wall. A similar mindset is all too commonly reflected in the real world, where many of us are disconnected from this ecosystem, separate and ambivalent, making its creatures even more susceptible to our damage. The ocean serves as a barrier in both art and life, as an afterthought, a space filler. But if drastic actions aren't taken, our oceans will look a lot like the ones in Skyrim and The Witcher 3 sooner rather than later. Though the oceans in Skyrim and The Witcher 3 reveal to us the shape of our oceans to come, Abzu may represent the future of our seas in a different way. Throughout its 8 chapters, the game depicts idealized versions of our different underwater ecosystems, from lively reefs to mysterious depths, with many different species interacting and filling up the space. The player can swim among the animals, roll into a ball, breach the water, and even hitch a ride on many of these species. For a more relaxed experience, if that's possible, the player can find a statue and meditate on it, allowing them to view the different creatures as they swim, the camera following the animal and displaying the species' Latin designation and its common name. In the later chapters, the player can even swim with extinct fauna, with Mesosaurus, Ichthyosaurus, and Helicoprion. The player is able to see these creatures in a simulacrum of a natural environment, and can even interact with them. It's kind of like a playable Jurassic Park. It's exhilarating to see these extinct beasts swimming alongside you. It's totally surreal and profound in a way that's kind of hard to put into words, so I will put it on the screen instead. This chapter of Abzu works as a sort of digital interactive museum, allowing the player to explore these extinct creatures in a fun, tactile, and probably inaccurate way. If the climate trends continue unabated and our oceans continue to deteriorate, many of the currently extant animals featured in the game will no longer exist, much like the Archelon. Our oceans as we know them will be radically transformed. Endangered species will disappear from our world, but many will remain in the game. Our oceans, that is, the ecosystems and inhabitants of the seas and not just the literal water itself, will only exist in films and games like this. In the same way that we now interact with the Elasmosaurus with awe and joy, in the future, Abzu and other games could allow us to see and interact with species we have lost due to our own destructive activity and preserve the memories of these vulnerable figures. The future of our oceanic life may be strictly digital. Actual preservation is absolutely vital and necessary, but assuming the worst-case scenario, at least a shadow of our oceans may survive in games like Abzu. While the threats facing our oceans and our fragile ecosystems may be dire, the effects can be mitigated and in some areas even reversed. The largest drivers of this damage are corporations, and while these huge companies may seem invulnerable, they're run by people. People are squishy and can be convinced or forcibly ousted with large sustained movements. Such movements are not only required for the survival of our ecosystems and the prosperity of our species, they're morally imperative. The natural world is an inherent good and is deserving of our protection, or at the very, very least not deserving of annihilation. Holding liable those responsible for this destruction and affecting major change won't be easy, but it can and must be done. Ethics demand action, and letting our oceans become Skyrim's oceans would be unforgivable. What the future holds for us isn't yet clear, but our oceans are preserved in some sense in media. Children in the future can stare in awe at the digital blue whales and the sunfish in Abzu, or wonder like I did at the blurry sharks in National Geographic tapes, or at whatever will come after that, hardly believing the presence of these creatures. And when they ask us of the hammerhead or of the manatee, did these things really exist? Hopefully, we'll be able to respond, they still do.
We hope you have enjoyed this presentation from the National Geographic Video Library.